Tony, before the show starts, I think you need to tell folks we're on social media.
I do. We're on social media.
Well, there you go. We're now on Facebook and Instagram, and it's at Going Hollywood Pod on both of those.
So that's our handle, at Going Hollywood Pod, on both Facebook and Instagram.
And what are we posting, Tony?
And we're going to just be posting, we'll talk about the show occasionally, but mostly it's just going to be like, what's happening? Who's a birthday? Who do we want to talk about and commemorate today? Who died? Because that happens a lot. It'll be fun.
So it's at Going Hollywood Pod, and it's Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the show notes or on the website, goinghollywoodpodcast.com. You'll find them there too.
Go on, stay tuned.
Once upon a time, there was a typical American girl who happened to bump into a typical red-blooded American boy. And she bumped into him and bumped into him. So they decided they'd better sit down and talk this over before they had an accident. The boy found the girl attractive, desirable, irresistible. He did what any red-blooded American boy would do. He asked her to marry him. They had a typical wedding, went on a typical honeymoon, in a typical bridal suite. Except, it so happens that this girl is a witch.
Hello, I'm film historian Tony Maeda.
And I'm Brad Shreve, who's just a guy who likes movies.
We discuss movies and television from Hollywood's golden age. We go behind the scenes and share our opinions, too.
Being the average guy, my opinions are the ones that matter.
As does your self-delusion. Welcome to Going Hollywood. Hey, Brad, before we go any further, I'm going to sing. And you know what? You can't stop me this time, except for my voice.
Okay. Got me nervous.
You ready?
Sure.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Bewitched. Happy birthday to you. Yes. And you can't stop me because it's in the public domain. Well, you can stop me.
Yes, it is.
For my voice, you can stop me, but you can't stop me. Happy birthday, Bewitched. 60 years. One of the few things around that's older than me. 60 years. Yesterday, September 17th, 1964, Bewitched debuted on ABC. How about that?
Well, is it my turn to sing?
Do go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to break the rule because I tell you can't sing and then I'm going to sing.
I know what you're going to say.
Bewitched, bewitched, you've got me in your spell. Bewitched, bewitched, you know your craft so well. Before I knew what you were doing, I looked in your eyes. That brand of woo that you've been brewing took me by surprise. There we go. That's enough.
Wow.
And I'm sorry for those that had to bear that.
No, you sounded good. You, unlike you, I won't degrade your singing voice. You sounded good, boy. You had it going too. You sound a little bit like Steve Lawrence. Did you ever hear his version of it? Bewitched, bewitched.
No.
Yeah, it's quite the earworm. And
before we start on trivia, did you know that they wanted that, and because they ran out of time,
yeah,
that's why they did not have the lyrics in the theme song?
Yeah, they didn't have lyrics in time, which I'm glad. I'm glad that's just, I like it's instrumental. I think if it was someone singing, you'd say, who's that? Is that Darren? Yeah. Who's singing that song? Larry Tate? Who's singing that song? Unless it was Peggy Lee, then you'd be like, doesn't sound like Elizabeth Montgomery. Anyway, it's a long way around going to say that we are doing a special, ultra special, supersized episode of Bewitched. Actually, 2 episodes on Bewitched. Now, listener, Brad is always against me doing 2-parters. He doesn't like us to do 2-part episodes. But I said to him, look, we have to do 2 parts for this for several reasons. First of all, it's really, to me, 2 different series. Because the only series I can think of in which 40% of the original cast changed during the run of the show, So you have, not just, of course, the most famous, the Darrens, but you have 2 different Louise Tates, 2 different Gladys Kravitzes. Frank Stevens started out as one actor, changed to another actor, and then came back to the original actor for the last season. So, you know, it's like two different shows, don't you think?
Yes, I do. And actually, you left out Marion Lauren, who was
but her character didn't change.
No, her character didn't change, but she was my favorite next to Uncle
She's
Arthur.
everybody's favorite.
Then she unfortunately passed away, and then they brought was it 2 seasons later they brought Esmeralda in?
Yes, actually, we're getting into our tidbits here, but yes, actually, they approached Alice Ghostly to replace the irreplaceable Alice Pierce as Gladys Kravitz, and Alice Ghostly, to her everlasting credit, said no. She was a friend of mine. She's irreplaceable. And so that's how we got I can't really talk about Sandra Gould right now, but that's how. But yes, then Esmeralda, they created the character of Esmeralda, who was a absent-minded witch, but she wasn't Aunt Clara. They made a very clear point. We cannot replace Marion Lauren.
Yeah, and that was a smart move. Well, Elizabeth Montgomery said no.
Yes, she did. She was adamant. She was very close. She was very close with Marion Lauren. She actually accepted Marion Lauren's posthumous Emmy Award when Marion Lauren won Best Supporting Actress the year that she died, the 4th season of the
Okay, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
We're getting way ahead of ourselves.
Let's talk about 1164 Morning Glory Circle.
Let's do it. I wanted to ask you what Bewitched has meant to you as a person, as a gay man. What's its significance in your life?
I remember watching this, I think it was every day in reruns with my mom. It was always a big deal. One of my mom's consistent lines was, when I wanted something and I didn't want to wait, she would say, "I'm not Samantha." I absolutely adored it. I got to tell you, watching it again, I'm like, God, there's so much to nitpick about this show. And who gives a damn? It's fun as hell.
Yeah.
So won't even go there, at least not right away. But I adored Uncle Arthur. I don't know if it was because of his flamboyant, which, he was gay, despite he never admitted it that I know of. Or I just loved that he was a jokester. But God, he was only like 10 episodes and he had such an impact. I might guarantee if you interviewed people, they would say, I think he was probably on 30 episodes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the sign of a true impactful actor, like Cloris Leachman on Mary Tyler Moore. People can't believe that she was only in like 2 or 3 episodes a season. And you're like, but she was the impact. I mean, he was a hugely impactful. Same with Dr. Bombay. I always loved Dr. Bombay. I love the way Dr. Bombay disappeared. I loved he would just do that hand motion. It was so elegant. It was just, and he was gone. He didn't do the arms like Agnes Moorehead. He just went, it was great. Or Samantha's snatch.
I also love that he always showed up when he was in the middle of doing something kinky. Most of the time. Always doing something bizarre, and half the time it's kinky with his nurses.
With his nurses. Like you, I mean, I remember very well reruns. This is just, this colors my childhood. This is in the fabric of my childhood, this show, watching it on after school. And just watching, I tell you what was really amazing for me was because they didn't show, the Screen Gems did not show the black and white episodes in syndication when Bewitched first syndicated, because they figured no one would watch them. They were really hard to come by. And then I believe it was probably Nick at Night that first showed the black and white ones. And my mind was blown when I saw the black and white ones. They're so different. And just experiencing Alice Pierce after years and years of the annoying, aggravating, insufferable Sandra Gould, I couldn't believe it. So I became obsessed with the black and white ones. So much so that there was an actor strike in the 80s, early 80s, and I wrote a letter to ABC and I said, would you please, you don't have any programming, why not show the original black and white episode, or the black and white episodes of Bewitched, because you can never see them anywhere. And I think I kind of created Nick at Night. I got to tell you right now. TV, they never answered me, but hello. So when you're watching TV Land, right here, it's me, my idea. You're welcome, world.
As a fan of TV Land, I'll say thank you. And I want to go back to Sandra Gould for a minute, Gladys Kravitz.
If we must.
Because you said that they didn't show the black and white. She's the only one I knew as Gladys Kravitz.
Yeah.
That's all I knew. And I loved her and hated her at the same time. She was very annoying. So when the first time that I saw Alice Pierce, I'm like, what is this Gladys Kravitz? And I absolutely hated her because it just rubbed me wrong. It was like this isn't right. Watching it again, I'm like, wow, she's really good.
She's brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. She was a brilliant, brilliant actress. She was very Carol Burnett-like. You know, if Carol Burnett's career had gone a different way, if Carol Burnett didn't have that incredible singing voice, I think, that, you know, took her to Broadway and led her to Variety, she would have been a fantastic Mrs. Kravitz.
Oh, she would have been.
Because, I mean, she's a little too young, especially for George Tobias to be George Tobias' wife. But then again, there's Vivian Vance and Bill Frawley, so you never know.
Yeah.
But yeah, to me, Alice Pierce has such humor, has such charm, has such nuance. Sandra Gould has no nuance. Sandra Gould has no charm. Sandra Gould is just annoying. But anyway, yes, we're getting way ahead of ourselves, way ahead of ourselves. What we're going to do today, dear listener, is we're going to kind of take the template of our Mary Tyler Moore episode and expand it, because we've decided to do 2 separate episodes. On this episode today, we're going to discuss the first 5 seasons of Bewitched, aka the Dick York years. And then in part 2, next week, stay tuned for next week's episode, we will talk about the Dick Sargent episodes. So basically the 3 seasons that Dick Sargent played Darren. But today, it's Dick York land, Dick York time, and I'm so happy about that.
And you mentioned I don't like 2-parters. When you first said to me, I kind of shuddered for a second. And I thought, no, this one we have to. I got to tell you, though, this was the most painful, the most excruciating assignment that you've given me.
Oh, God, why?
I had how out of 254 episodes do I pick my favorite? I mean, I have my choice, but I'm like, all these others, I want to talk about them all. We need a whole...
Well, that's why...
We could do a Bewitched podcast.
Well, that's why... Yeah, we should, actually. But that's why I said it has to be 2 episodes. Because there was no way. As hard as it was on Mary Tyler Moore, this was such a challenge. And I don't know, and even splitting it into 2 parts, I still had a hell of a time picking 4 episodes for the Dick York years. It was so difficult because I love them, almost all of them, so very much. So very much.
I'm the same way. I'm like, I have all these other episodes I'd love to talk about, but I had to break it down. And like, okay, these are the best, or they really reflect the show. Hopefully both.
Well, maybe when people listen to this, they will email us, text us, their suggestions for their favorite episodes, and who knows, we can have a Bewitched 61st anniversary.
I'd love that. Please do so.
I would love that too. I love that it's 60 years on September 17th, 1964. And, you know, I think the reason we're here, the reason we're all here celebrating Bewitched comes down to 2 words, and those 2 words are Elizabeth Montgomery. Has there ever been a more charming, more beautiful, more luminous television star than Elizabeth Montgomery? I really don't think so. I mean, you know, I love Mary Tyler Moore. God knows I love Lucy. Elizabeth Montgomery is up there with them in the pantheon. She is the most charming, lovable, just effervescent TV star I think there ever was.
And if you're used to Samantha, as you usually saw her as a really good playing housewife, watch the first episode where Samantha's so uncomfortable because Darren takes her to the society meeting and
yes.
Samantha dresses up inappropriately and Darren's ex-fiance is there. And she plays that so well. And after seeing her play the housewife for so long and then seeing her in this incident where she's so unsure of herself, I'm like, wow, she really is a good actress.
She was a wonderful actress. Well, all I have to do is watch her post-Bewitched work. I mean, it's all on YouTube. Mm-hmm. The Legend of Lizzie Borden, chilling. A Case of Rape, chilling. She did those Edna Buchanan mysteries before she died. Incredible work, incredible work. Here's the thing about Elizabeth Montgomery was nominated for 9 Emmys and 4 Golden Globes. She was nominated for Bewitched 5 times. And I just want to get this out there in the beginning, okay? She was nominated. She never won an Emmy for Bewitched. Now, as I said before, we all know how much I love Lucy, okay? But in 1967 and 1968, Lucille Ball won back-to-back Emmys for Outstanding Actress in a Comedy. Now, the first one in 67 is really touching. She hadn't won an Emmy in a long time. She was totally surprised. Her speech is very touching. And then she won again. So I'm just gonna put this out there. Let's please take back one of those, the 68, the repeat, because she didn't care. She was kind of sarcastic in her speech, and she really didn't care. She was like, "Oh, I'm winning again." I think she had a piece of cheese in her mouth. Give it to Elizabeth Montgomery. How can you not give this woman an Emmy for this performance? I don't understand it. It's one of the biggest travesties in Emmy history, in awards history, as far as I'm concerned.
I agree 100%. When I saw that, I was absolutely amazed that it wasn't more.
It's shocking, isn't it? It's shocking.
Yes, it really was.
So for those
especially when you consider how popular the show was. I mean, there were seasons that was above Beverly Hillbillies.
Oh, it was the number one rated TV sitcom in its first season. It was number 2. It was behind Bonanza. But as far as comedies go, it was the number one rated comedy on television. It was ABC's first biggest hit ever. It was ABC's an entire network's biggest hit ever. It was huge. And it was in the top 10 for its first 3 seasons, and then it fell to like 11, the final 2, and then the unfortunate occurrence happened, and we'll talk about Dick Sargent, but there was an immediate drop in the ratings once Dick York left, and it went to 24, and then it just bottomed out. So in its last year, I think it was 72, which I think is unfortunate, and we'll get to this in our next episode, because there are some episodes from the final season I actually really like. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that later.
I agree. Well, I know for a fact that ABC, when it comes to between CBS and NBC, ABC is much younger.
Much.
Still been around a while, but it's much younger. So you're telling me that for the decade and a half, I'm going to guess, maybe 2 decades that it was on, actually probably a decade and a half, it never really had a hit?
It had a couple hits, but it didn't have this kind of it didn't have Lucy. It didn't have The Honeymooners. It didn't have George Burns and Gracie Allen. These were all CBS, NBC. So when they bought this little series about a witch who marries a mortal from Screen Gems, they had no idea. They had no idea what was going to happen. In fact, there was some resistance to it because they thought that it would not be accepted in the South, the idea of a witch. It was a little too conservative for the South, so they were a little worried. And then Chevrolet, the sponsor, came on board, and they said, let's do it. And it became their biggest hit ever. Their biggest hit ever. So I think it's amazing.
And the last thing before we get into it, I want to say about Elizabeth Montgomery, she should have won more awards, but at least it made her very rich.
Oh, yeah. Well, she had a piece of it. Yeah. She got a piece of it in the 6th season and then a bigger piece of it in the last season. So God bless her. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about Elizabeth Montgomery, and then we'll go into Bewitched, because I think it's important to put it in context. For people who don't know, for her formative years, Elizabeth Montgomery was basically known as Robert Montgomery's daughter, because she was the daughter of Robert Montgomery, who was a very, very big movie star in the early talkies. I mean, right up until the late 40s. He became a director in the late 40s. He played Philip Marlowe in Lady in the Lake. He was in Night Must Fall. He got an Academy Award nomination. He was also instrumental in the formation of the Screen Actors Guild. So he was quite a guy, Robert Montgomery. He was a big star in the early. He was with them all. He was with Garbo. He was with Crawford. He was with Shearer, because MGM was top heavy with actresses. They didn't have enough really strong actors until Clark Gable came along, until Spencer Tracy came along. So Robert Montgomery stepped in. So the point of that being, Robert Montgomery was a big movie star. He was married to a Broadway actress, Elizabeth Allen, and they had a daughter in 1933, and her name is Elizabeth Montgomery. She was born on April 15th, 1933. And she wanted to follow in her father's footsteps. She was a Beverly Hills kid. She grew up in privilege. She was surrounded by luxury. She had a lot of celebrity friends, but that was the way it was back then. They were all it was an industry town. She even said that, I didn't think I was anything special. My father went to work every day and came home, and my mother was there, and we had this house, and I rode my bike, and I went to school, and that's the way it was. So it wasn't until later on she realized her lineage and the tradition when she wanted to become an actress. And she became an actress and began her career in 1951 on her father's TV show. Her father had, in the early 50s, another amazing thing about Robert Montgomery was he realized the potential in television. Not a lot of people did. Most people in the movies stayed far away from television. He realized the potential, and he produced a show called Robert Montgomery Presents. And it was a big show in the 50s, and Elizabeth Montgomery made her acting debut on his show in 1951. And that's how she got started.
And I didn't know that stuff. Usually you don't catch me by surprise too much because I do a little bit of delving, not nearly as much as you do. But I had no idea that was her father.
Yeah. No, he's a great guy. It's funny because he was very conservative, but 50s conservative, not batshit crazy conservative like we think today. he was basically a Democrat, is what I'm trying to say. He was very conservative, and his daughter Elizabeth was very liberal. So they had a lot of battles in that way. But here's a conservative who was instrumental in creating the Screen Actors Guild. So hello, that tells you something right there. He had a lot of integrity, Robert Montgomery. But one of his co-stars was also one of Elizabeth Montgomery's mentors and later best friends, Bette Davis. Now, Bette Davis and Robert Montgomery did not like each other. They made a film together called June Bride, in which it's amazing they got through it because they didn't kill each other. But when Elizabeth Montgomery was in New York as an actress trying to make her way, she ran into Bette Davis at a party. And of course, they knew, the family. And Bette Davis became a mentor to Elizabeth Montgomery, which was really kind of sweet. And I'll just tell one quick funny story, and then we'll get into Bewitched history. But so Elizabeth Montgomery was hanging out at Bette Davis's house one day, and they were talking. And Bette Davis was the only person that Elizabeth Montgomery let call her Betty. Nobody else could call her Betty. She was Elizabeth. Later, she was Lizzie, but never Betty. But she let Bette Davis do it.
Wow.
So they're having a discussion at Bette Davis's house one day, and they got into a disagreement. And they got into an argument. And Elizabeth Montgomery said that Bette Davis got up and stormed out of the room, and then turned around and said, "Betty, when they make a movie of my life, you should play me. And I don't think that's necessarily a compliment." And then she turned and walked out.
Oh, I love that.
So Elizabeth Montgomery had some fire in her, I'll tell you anyway.
Tony, you and I get excited when we get messages and emails and texts from listeners that tell us how much they enjoy the show.
We do.
But I think we should push it a little bit and ask them to go a little bit further.
Ooh, a challenge.
If you enjoy this show, let others know. 5 stars are great, whatever you want to give, except 1 star. If you have 1 star, say, that show's not for me and move on. We accept that.
Yeah, you don't give us 1 star. Be kind. Just say, no, not for me. Just skip it. Or tell your friends. That's the best way too, right? Tell your friends, hey, I have this great fun podcast with these 2 kooky guys who talk about movies and TV. We run the gamut. We have everything.
Yeah, we're all over the place.
We're all over the place is a better way to put it.
But in a good way. So do it right now before you forget.
So Elizabeth Montgomery was a very busy actress in the 50s. She was working on her father's show. She was doing a lot of TV. She was nominated for an Emmy for an episode of The Untouchables, actually. And she was in a movie called Johnny Cool. And when she was on this movie, on the set of Johnny Cool, she met her director. And her director was a guy named William Asher. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, William Asher is kind of another one of these legendary directors from TV's golden age. He worked on a little TV show called I Love Lucy. So if you like I Love Lucy, his very first episode was actually Job Switching, the Candy Factory episode. So, William Asher had some cred. I mean, when Lucille Ball likes you, yeah, you got some cred. So William Asher was a very famous TV director that he was branching out into films, and he met Elizabeth Montgomery on the set of Johnny Cool. They fell in love. William Asher and Elizabeth Montgomery got married. They wanted to find a project in which they could work together. And they went to a company called Screen Gems with an idea they had for a TV show called The Fun Couple. And it was a story that was centered around a millionairess who marries a mechanic. And they face all these problems due to opposition from his family. And they brought it to the company Screen Gems. Now, Screen Gems was pretty well known in the industry for creating really family-oriented sitcoms. They did Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, this kind of stuff. And Screen Gems was headed by this guy named Harry Ackerman, who used to be president of CBS, and then he took over Screen Gems. And do you remember, Brad, when we talked about Tootsie, and I said to you that it's a lot more common than you think when 2 projects kind of are being created independently of each other without the other one's knowledge, and they kind of come together? to create another project?
Yes. Yeah, we had that whole discussion. I don't know where you're going with this. This has my interest.
Well, this is exactly what happened in this case. Because while Elizabeth Montgomery was with Bill Asher and they were talking about this show called The Fun Couple, there was a project being developed at Screen Gems by a writer-producer named Saul Sachs. Saul Sachs was interested in he liked the idea. His two inspirations were the film I Married a Witch and the film Bell, Book, and Candle. I Married a Witch was from the 40s with Frederick March and Veronica Lake, and Bell, Book, and Candle had Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak. And they're both about witches. Kim Novak and Veronica Lake both play witches. So Saul Sachs developed this series about a witch who marries a mortal. And just as it was being developed, Bill Asher brought this idea called The Fun Couple to Screen Gems. And the two came together at this time to develop Bewitched. Now, the show Bewitched, the original idea that Screen Gems was developing, was originally offered to the actress Tammy Grimes. Remember, we talked about her in The Boys in the Band.
Yes.
But she decided she didn't want it. She didn't want to play the role. So they were looking for an actress. And it was exactly the same time that Elizabeth Montgomery and William Asher brought them the idea for this show called The Fun Couple. And they went, wait a minute. Let's bring these together. Here's our witch right here. It's Elizabeth Montgomery. And that's how that project first began.
Well, I didn't know that. I knew that it was based on the two movies. I don't think I've ever seen I Married a Witch, but Bell, Book, and Candle, if you haven't seen it, but you know Bewitched, watch it, and you're like, oh, this is where Bewitched came from.
Yeah, it is pretty good. And Kim Novak's wonderful. Is wonderful in it. So that's how that happened. Now, the character in the original premise for Bewitched was not called Samantha. Do you know what she was called?
I heard it a long time ago, so no, I don't remember.
The character was called Cassandra.
Yes.
When it was offered to Tammy Grimes, it was called, her name was Cassandra, but Elizabeth Montgomery nixed that. She said, no. She said, I don't like that name because of all of its Greek mythological implications, Cassandra, it's gloom and doom. And then they said to her, well, why don't we call her Elizabeth? And she hated that even more. She thought, no. That is so egotistical, I can't even do that. So she's throwing a little shade to the Lucys and the Marys out there when their characters are named after them. But anyway, she said, I couldn't imagine having a TV character named after me. No. I like the name Samantha. So she came up with the name Samantha. So the character was named Samantha. Now they had to find a husband. And when Tammy Grimes was involved, they approached the actor Richard Crenna, and he declined. And then they offered it to a second actor, a very familiar name. And do you know what his name was, Brad?
Let me think. Is it Dick Sargent?
It was Dick Sargent. I didn't stop you. You got that one.
No, I knew that one.
Good for you. You got that one. Yes. Darren was offered to Dick Sargent first. So all you anti-Dick Sargent people out there, of which I am one, so I got to eat.
There are many.
I got to eat this crow too. Dick Sargent was actually offered the part of Darren first, but he was already committed to another series. So they went with their third choice, which was an actor named Dick York. And Dick York was a gifted comedic actor who had been in films and TV. He won praise for his role in the movie Inherit the Wind, opposite Gene Kelly and Spencer Tracy. He's a wonderful actor. He was a wonderful actor. He was also in the TV production just before this, the TV version of the film Going My Way, also with Gene Kelly. So he auditioned with Elizabeth Montgomery, and according to Dick York, their chemistry was immediate. And I don't know about you, but I mean, for me personally, I would totally agree with that. I think their chemistry is so wonderful. I think they have such a romantic, loving chemistry between them that it's immediate. It makes sense. They seem like they're a couple. They seem like they're a young couple in love.
Yes, most definitely.
And you can see why she would put up with his request that she deny her heritage and who she is because she wants to please him so much. I totally buy that. I think their chemistry is absolutely wonderful. I think he's a wonderful comedic actor. So they had their Darren and they had their Samantha. Now they needed the third major character of Samantha's mother. And do you know how?
Now
do you know how that came about?
Well, I know that she was called, I think, just Mother.
Right. Agnes Moorehead called her
the
Endora.
Actress. Yes, Agnes Moorehead is the one that gave her a name, which is a great name. And I got to say this about Endora. She is the country's first well-known bitchy drag queen.
Well, that's
Endora.
true. That's true. Yes, and Agnes Moorehead came up with the name Endora. It's based on the witch of Endor from the Hebrew Bible, and she was an entity who could summon the dead, basically, in the Hebrew Bible. And if you know anything about it, Agnes Moorehead's really fascinating. She was the daughter of a minister. She was almost what we would call fundamentalist Christian. Agnes Moorehead was, which seems kind of antithetical that she would then play a witch.
I always thought that. I did know that about her. And the fact that she played a witch.
Yes.
And the fact that she was working with Elizabeth Montgomery, who we know is very liberal. But I'm going to jump ahead. I'm also thinking that may be one of the reasons why she didn't like Dick Sargent as well. We'll get to that later. Next episode.
Yes, we'll get to that later, because that was a big thing too, that I was like, oh, really? This is interesting. So the story goes, and this is according to Elizabeth Montgomery told this story, that they didn't know who they were going to get to play this larger-than-life crazy mother. And Elizabeth Montgomery was in New York shopping in a department store one day, and she said she heard this extraordinary voice behind her talking to the salesperson. And she said she turned around and she saw this woman with huge head of red hair, orange-like hair, wrapped up in pink tulle. And she approached the woman and she said, "Excuse me, are you?" And the woman said immediately, "Agnes Moorehead, yes." And she said, "Oh, I'm Elizabeth Montgomery." And she was, "Oh, how are you?" Blah, blah, because everyone knew her father and everything. She said, "Have you ever thought about doing a TV series?" And Agnes Moorehead said, No. Well, maybe." It was that fast. So obviously something happened in the conversation, because Agnes Moorehead wasn't just some, out-of-work actress shopping in the department store. I mean, this woman had already had a very, very illustrious career. She was in what is arguably the most famous film of all time, or the greatest film of all time, Citizen Kane.
And I argue that.
You argue the greatest film of all time?
Yes, I will argue that. We'll have to go into the Citizen Kane one day.
Oh, yeah, I do too. I don't think so.
I think people will remember her from two roles that are a little later. First of all, definitely they'll remember her from The Twilight Zone.
Yes.
What is continuously rated, many people rate it as the best Twilight Zone ever. It is the episode where she is a mute woman, and it was in 1961, just before this show started. And it was the one called The Invaders, where the tiny ship was attacking the Earth Woman, air quotes, the Earth Woman.
Yes.
And it's a brilliant episode. She doesn't say a word, and she's so good in it. The other thing that I also remember, and it's a very short role for her, is in How the West Was Won.
Yes.
She played I can't remember what her role was, but I remember she was on a raft and she drowned.
Yes. Yes. Well, one of her lifelong friends was Debbie Reynolds. They were very close. She was also in The Singing Nun with Debbie Reynolds. And this is going to be off tangent, but I'm going to tell it because it's a Carrie Fisher story. So anyway, Paul Lynde, when he had a couple drinks in him, not only became very obnoxious, so they say, but he would say things about people. And he is the one who really started the rumor that Agnes Moorehead was a lesbian. Okay. Now, I'm sure there's people out there who've heard this, that Agnes Moorehead was a lesbian, because, Bewitched is basically the gayest show ever. And this is what's funny, because, and so Carrie Fisher talked about this, and she said, my mother, Debbie Reynolds, was very close with Agnes Moorehead. They were in The Singing Nun together. They were in How the West Was Won together. She'd probably consider her almost her daughter. They were that close. And she said her mother would get very offended that people would say Agnes Moorehead was a lesbian, because she was just a very strict Christian woman. There really wasn't anything about sexuality about her. I mean, she would come to the set with her script in one hand and a Bible in the other. Wow. This is who Agnes Moorehead was. Isn't that funny? So anyway, but Debbie Reynolds also had rumors that she was a lesbian. Someone brought that up to Carrie Fisher, mostly begun by her former husband, Eddie Fisher. And Carrie Fisher always said, "No. My mother was not a lesbian. My mother was just a very, very bad heterosexual."
Oh, that sounds so Carrie.
Anyway, I'm way off the subject there. So
we have a
lot more to do.
We have a lot of episodes to cover.
We do. So let's get into the production of this. We're going to talk about the production and the pilot. Do you want to talk a little bit about the pilot of Bewitched, the first episode? Darren, take you, Samantha.
I gotta say, I love this episode, and it's one of the things I'm kind of disappointed in Bewitched, because this episode, it is so sexy.
Mm-hmm.
It's the beginning when Darren and Samantha had just a touch on when they met very quickly, but then it's after they got married, and Samantha is trying to explain to Darren that she is a witch. He, of course, doesn't believe her, so she has to do some spells. But there is this chemistry between the two.
Yeah.
You believe this is a couple that are madly in love. And the other thing is, Darren's a man about town. He talks about with his ex-fiance about cruises they went on and these fancy trips. And he and Samantha go to her house for a party, and it's with all these hoity-toity people. And what I wish is that we had that sexiness as a young, hip couple for like the first season, and then transfer them over into Morning Glory Circle.
Yes.
I really loved that we had that the first episode, but then the second episode, they moved to the suburbs. So I hate to complain because I loved them in Morning Glory Circle. I think the fact that they had so many outdoor shoots is one of the reasons why the show was so successful, because it felt real.
Yes.
They walked across the street to their neighbors. They had a yard. They had trees. They worked outside. And indoors. Everyone loved the house, but they felt like a real couple, except one happened to be a witch with family members that are kooky.
Yes, yes. Well,
we all have family members that are kooky.
There's the fun couple for you, Elizabeth Montgomery and
Yes.
And Bill Asher's pilot. It leaks in there. Well, I think though that that's the thing about the pilot is the pilot. First of all, the pilot, they began filming the pilot on November 22nd, 1963. So, quite an auspicious date to start working on a TV series. But despite the fact they were shaken, Bill Asher said they were determined to keep the schedule and plow through. And Bill Asher was a personal friend of John F. Kennedy's. He produced the Happy Birthday, Mr. President, famous Marilyn Monroe segment.
And I do want to stop you for our younger folks. That day, what we're talking about is the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Do you really think anybody listening to this podcast is so young?
Yes.
Okay.
Because not everybody's good with dates.
Okay, yes. The date the President Kennedy was assassinated they began. But they managed to plot on through. Elizabeth Montgomery, by the way, P.S., was 3 months pregnant during the filming of the pilot. I don't know if you could notice that. Her outfits were pretty blousy, and she's in a negligee for part of it, too.
Yeah, I had known that before, and I forgot. And I'm like, oh, my goodness, look at her. She is pregnant. And I remembered.
Yeah. Yeah, you can kind of tell you can tell, especially when the show picked up a year later almost when they began filming the series. It was like a year between the pilot and then she had her baby and then she recovered. And she looked fabulous. Know what I love about the pilot is, did you notice in the pilot they mention when she confesses to Darren, I'm a cauldron stirring, broom riding witch. He talks about his aunt who thinks she's a lighthouse and she stands up on the roof, to warn the ships when it's raining. And that came back. I love that little because when his parents meet Aunt Clara later on, Elizabeth Montgomery says to him, "You have an aunt who thinks she's a lighthouse." I love that consistency. That was they planted that scene. Of course, it all went to shit after that. It all fell in the toilet, and there were two different Darrens and two different Louis. But you know what I'm saying? They started it out with real integrity, which I love about the early part of this series.
But even with the cast changes, most of the show was pretty good at continuity. There were some errors.
Please, how many?
Much better than the other shows in the 60s. A lot of shows just didn't even care about continuity. I think they did a pretty good job.
I got to disagree with you. There are actors and actresses who play Darren's clients, the same actor, over and over, and you're like, oh my god, her again, him again. How many times has this guy been on this show as a different client? It was annoying.
And he also had a different secretary, it seemed like, every week.
Yeah, there was no continuity in the secretaries at all.
But I'm just talking about continuity in the story.
So I love that. You know what else I love about this episode? The first few episodes is it's like a 2-part episode, because you have the first part where he finds out she's a witch. And you think that would be the entire series, entire episode. It wasn't. It was only the first part. And then there's a second act, and it's Sheila.
Yes.
I love Sheila. It's Sheila, Darren's ex, played by the wonderful Nancy Kovacs. Oh, I love that. I love it. Sheila. Tell us about Sheila.
Well, Sheila, we aren't going to talk about too much during the pilot, because I get to talk about an episode later when she comes back, which I'm very excited. Yes. They brought it back, I think it was 3 years later.
Yes, twice.
But she is this...
2 episodes in a row.
She is this royal, rich bitch.
Yes.
Who was engaged to Darren, and she does everything she could to humiliate Samantha. And that's why I said Samantha wears the wrong clothes. She told Samantha that the party that her and Darren were going to was casual. So Samantha wears this casual outfit and asks Darren, "Are you sure?" And he goes, "Oh, yes." And of course, everybody's dressed to the nines when Samantha shows up. And she's very condescending to Samantha. And let's just say she's such a bitch that when Samantha gets even with her, it's rich.
It's rich. It's so rich, they had to do it again in color the second time.
Yes.
For your episode, which we'll talk
Yes.
more about. The wonderful Sheila. And the second thing I love about this episode is Dave. Do you know who Dave is?
Dave.
Dave.
No.
Darren's drinking buddy.
Oh, I know you're talking about the guy that was always complaining about his wife.
Yes. Dave is
Okay.
Dave is Darren's drinking buddy.
Yes. And that's all he ever did.
Yes, he was played by an actor named Gene Blakely. Okay, and yes, that's all he ever did. All he ever did was meet Darren. Whenever Darren would be upset, suddenly Darren would be in a bar and he would be drinking with him. He only appeared in 8 episodes of Bewitched, and mostly in the first year. His final appearance was in the 4th season. And it was the episode As If We Never Met, which is kind of fitting because he's remembering they were figuring out what it'd be like if they never met. So naturally, Dave is there. But I love Dave. Dave never listens to a word Darren is saying. He just answers him. You know, he talks, Darren talks, he talks. Darren says, "My wife is a witch. They're all witches." Blah, blah. I know it's so funny. He's totally oblivious. And then he drinks his drink and leaves. So I love Dave. I think Dave is such a great character.
Yeah.
All right. So the pilot was filmed, and the first episodes were filmed almost a year later. And when Bewitched premiered, it got mostly positive reviews, particularly for the actors. And they realized that they had a hit on your hands because by the end of the first season, as we said, it was the second highest rated show on television. Now, before we go into episodes, I have a couple questions for you. And I want to see if you know this.
All right.
Endora called Darren by his correct name 8 times during the whole series. 3 times in just one episode. Because she had a charm. She was under the spell of a charm, so she called him Darren. But what were some of the other names that Endora called Darren?
The one I heard, I always remember the most is Darwood.
Durwood. Durwood's the most famous one. Yes,
Durwood.
yes.
Durwood. Darwood, Devon,
Yes. Dobbin, Delmore,
Dobbin,
Dustin, Dirty.
It's a running joke that never got old.
It's hysterical. It's hysterical. I love it. I love it. I love it. And okay, here's another tidbit for you. Elizabeth Montgomery didn't really twitch her nose. What was it she was actually twitching?
That I knew. Her upper lip.
Correct, because it was a nervous habit she had that she wasn't even aware of until Bill Asher mentioned it to her.
I learned that when they made that horrible Bewitched movie.
Yes.
And I can't remember who the actress was that played Samantha.
Nicole Kidman.
Okay, Nicole Kidman played Samantha, and she talked about how she had to learn how to do that twitch of her upper lip, whereas it came naturally with Elizabeth Montgomery. That's the only reason I know.
It was a nervous habit that she wasn't even aware of. And then she did it right before they started filming, and Bill Asher said, "That's it. What you just did, that's it." But Elizabeth Montgomery said if she ever had like a glass of wine or she was tired, she couldn't do it. So she had to be very diligent that she wouldn't do it. All right, so should we dive into these episodes? Wow, we're already way in and we're just hitting our first episode here.
Yeah, this could be a long one.
This is, so strap in everybody, because this is going to be fun. So my first episode is not much further after this episode. My first episode is from season 1. It's episode 4, and it's called Mother Meets What's His Name. From October 8th, 1964, written by Danny Arnold and directed by Bill Asher. And just like we said, many of these early episodes, it's really 2 episodes in one. There's a story for Act 1, and there's a story for Act 2. Now, this was the 3rd episode shot, but it was actually the 4th one to air. And the easy way to tell that is because it's the last one with the narration. And the narration in the pilot, Once Upon a Time, There Was a Normal American Girl, is actually by Jose Ferrer. So I guess they figured, isn't that amazing? So I guess they figured it was a little too expensive to pay this Oscar-winning actor to narrate our series. We're going to stop the narration. So this is the last one. I just love this episode so much for these two great acts. The act one is when the welcome wagon appears, and it's our introduction. Well, it's not our introduction, but it's our first long-term exposure to the brilliance of Alice Pierce as Gladys Kravitz. Oh, she's so funny in this episode.
Definitely.
She's so funny. What happens in part one is that the neighbors come over to welcome Samantha to the neighborhood. It's these three women. It's Alice Pierce, Gladys Kravitz, and June and Shirley, who appeared in another episode later on. I think the witches are out and then disappeared, which is unfortunate because they're fun too. And they're snooping and they're trying to figure out, and Elizabeth Montgomery doesn't have anything unpacked. And so they're being real nosy neighbors. And they go into the kitchen to have this cake that they brought, and there's no china, there's no cups, there's no silverware. But of course, magically, bone china, there's sterling silver, and this goes over their heads. They're totally oblivious to it. But the best part of the episode is that their telephone hasn't been hooked up yet. So while the other ladies are in the other room dealing with the children who have been tied up, 2 children get tied up and one doesn't. Who tied up the third child? That's what Gladys keeps saying that, but nobody's listening to her. So she runs into the kitchen to call Abner, and she calls him on the phone, and he doesn't understand it either. And she's like, don't you understand? 2 kids tied up and one not tied up is normal. How did the third kid get tied up? So she hangs up, and as she's about to leave, the doorbell rings, and she goes to the door, and it's the telephone repairman there to set up the telephone. And so she lets him in, and she goes to leave, and she turns to Samantha and says, oh, I let in the telephone repairman to hook up your telephone. And she leaves, and she walks away, and she stops, and she does a take, and she looks right at the camera and says, to hook up your telephone. It is such a brilliant take. I love Alice Pierce. What do you think of that?
Let's talk about George Tobias for 1 second.
Sure.
He was so dry.
Oh, he
was perfect. He was perfect. And he stayed that way through the whole series.
He did, even when he was with the annoying Sandra Gould. He was the same character.
Yes.
But she is so wonderful. The take she does, they're so big. But they're so funny and they're so believable. And you have such sympathy for her. I have no sympathy for Sandra Gould at all. She's just annoying. I wish she would go away. I wish someone would turn her into a toad or an artichoke and she'd be done. But Alice Pierce, you just love her because nobody's listening to her. Nobody believes her. And the second part of the episode is exactly what happens is Endora meets what's his name. And Agnes Moorehead, to me, is so terrifying in this scene. She is so larger than life. I mean, she's just so imposing. And this is something I think that was lost as the series went on, was this sense of suspense and this sense of drama. You really get Agnes Moorehead's dramatic chops here. I mean, the woman was nominated for 4 Oscars, for God's sake. You get the strength of Endora and the intimidation of Endora. And when she first meets Darren and you think they're going to get along, and he wants to call her by her last name, and she goes, "You'll never be able to pronounce it. Just call me Endora."
Yeah.
And you think they might get along, and then it turns because Samantha doesn't do her witchcraft, and Endora wants to know why she's not. And she says, "Why do you prevent my daughter from being herself, young man?" And that's how it starts. So it ends horribly because Endora gets very furious and stands up and says, "Young man!" And Samantha saves Darren and says, "Mother, don't!" And she goes, "Very well." She goes, "Young man, consider yourself very lucky that you are not at this moment an artichoke." And then she does the most dramatic exit ever. I mean, smoke and fire and boom, 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 and she's gone. And we lost that as the series went on. I guess you couldn't do it every week, but I love that drama. I love that suspense. I love that intimidation of Agnes Moorehead.
Yeah, they really played up in the earlier years that she was a very powerful witch.
Right.
And it did come up in the later episodes, but not nearly as much.
Well, you really get the sense from Agnes Moorehead that she is a powerful witch. I mean, she's just in her demeanor, in her composure, the way she carries herself. I mean, the way she looks. You don't have to be told it. You get it. She could turn into an artichoke very quickly. But I love that episode. I love the fact that it sets up the relationship between Endora and what's his name. And mostly I just love the fact that Alice Pierce has just a wonderful, wonderful moment.
It's
in
probably
that
the
episode.
one episode where she and Darren got along well until things fell apart. Later seasons, they had to kind of unite together to do things to save Samantha. But that was the one episode where they got along until Samantha dropped the bomb.
Interesting you say they got along, because we're going to go on to my second episode. But before we do, I want to ask you, did you ever notice that in the first 6 seasons, Elizabeth Montgomery wears this really beautiful heart necklace in every single scene of every single episode? Did you ever notice that?
No, but I'm going to take a guess that it was from her husband, and because they split up at the end.
That's right.
She wasn't wearing it anymore.
It's very interesting. Yes, it was a gift. It was a white gold diamond pave heart that Bill Asher gave her as a love present, and she wore it throughout the first 5 seasons of Bewitched, up until sometime in the 6th season, it disappears. I'm not sure exactly which episode. There was also more than one. She got a replacement for it. And then in the final season, it's replaced by a necklace with the letter S on it. Unless she's wearing a choker, because she was very mod by then. She was very that girl by then. She had the long hair and the boots and stuff. So yeah, so some people might say that kind of was a harbinger of the fact that their marriage was falling apart, that she stopped wearing that beautiful heart necklace. All right, so my second episode choice is also from the first season. It's called A is for Aardvark, and it's from January 14th, 1965. It is written by Earl Barrett and directed by, and here's one of the reasons I love it, the wonderful, great, fantastic Ida Lupino. Now, if anybody doesn't know who Ida Lupino was, Ida Lupino was a pioneer. She was the only female director working in the studio system in the 50s and the 60s. She was a pioneering producer of her own films. She did social films. She was the first woman to direct a film noir. She was also an actress. She began as an actress at Warner Brothers in the 40s. She had quite a career. She was in High Sierra with Humphrey Bogart. So she was very accomplished. By this time, she transitioned to almost entirely directing. She would make occasional acting appearances. And she directed this. And she knew Agnes Moorehead. They had been together in Hollywood in the 40s. And I'm not saying there were problems, but the air was a little tense, according to Elizabeth Montgomery. Agnes Moorehead liked to give people a hard time. She really tested people. She was one of those broads, like Bette Davis, who liked to push the limits. So I love this episode because people call it a template episode, because it really is what the show is about. Because in the episode, Darren sprains his ankle. And exhausted Samantha's waiting on him, hand and foot, and she's exhausted. So she suggests that she cast a spell to make the house cooperate with him. And as you can imagine, the power goes to his head. And Endora says, "I told you so." So that's why I chose it. It's really the crux of the whole series. As Endora says, it's Adam and the proverbial apple all over again. And this is the first episode in which Endora calls Darren by his correct name. She calls him Darren as soon as he says to Samantha, "I've been wrong making you forego witchcraft all these years." So suddenly she likes Darren very much. So she calls him Darren. But I particularly love this episode because, of course, it devolves and Darren becomes greedier and greedier. And then suddenly he has a realization when Elizabeth Montgomery decides she has to go all full bore with him to make him see how ridiculous he's being. And she does. And in the end, he comes to the realization that this isn't the life he wants. And it happens because a necklace arrives that he had purchased for Samantha before this whole thing happened. And Samantha starts to cry. And she says to him, "I want you to believe, that this necklace and you mean more to me than anything in the world." It's the most moving and touching scene. And this is what I love about this show. And this is what I love about Elizabeth Montgomery. It's so moving. She's such a good actress. She's crying. It's heartwarming. And to me, it's kind of what the series lost as it went on. It lost this wonderful heart and this wonderful warmth, because it really is a love story. And it's highlighted so well in this episode.
Oh, I agree. You know what? I didn't remember this one. And then I looked up after you said you were going to do it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow, I love this one.
Yeah. And so Samantha, at the end, Darren says, "Is there any way you can make this all go away?" So Samantha basically turns back the clock. They didn't do that a lot in Bewitched, but they did it in this episode. And it's just a wonderful ending to this sweet, warm, just beautiful, beautiful episode. So that's my second episode.
Yeah.
You're up.
So I'm going to move us to the second season. And the reason why I chose my episode is because it's the first episode with Uncle Arthur and starring the incredible Paul Lynde, who he was my favorite in the series, kind of mixed with Aunt Clara. I'd have a tough time balancing the two. And, he's the whole reason to watch Hollywood Squares.
Yes.
I mean, go online and watch episodes of Hollywood Squares and you'll just laugh for hours. This episode I forgot how funny this episode was. Mm-hmm. This is the one episode I think I watched with the whole family. And we laughed and laughed and laughed. I mean, this is probably the funniest that Darren ever was in the series that I can recall.
And that's a tall order because Dick York was a very funny actor. He's very Jack Lemmon-like.
Yes. So the way the story goes is that Endora is visiting Sam and Darren, and all of a sudden things start being silly around the house, and they realize it's Uncle Arthur. So Paul Lynde makes his first appearance as Uncle Arthur, and he meets Darren, and Darren is really mad at Endora. And Arthur sees the antagonism that Darren has, and he pulls Darren aside and said, "Let's get even with her." Now, Arthur is Endora's brother.
So strange.
They've never gotten, they've never gotten along. It's implied. So you kind of think, oh, Arthur he wants to get even with Endora. So it makes it believable. So he decides he's going to tell Darren that he's going to give him powers, and he's going to teach him a incantation so that he can do something to Endora. He can put a spell on her. And what's so funny, Darren at first is reluctant, and then Arthur convinces him. And I don't remember if it's because Arthur was so persuasive. I think it was because Endora made him even madder. And he just wanted to get even with Endora.
And he's an asshole, basically.
Yes. So Arthur decides to teach Darren how to do a spell. And what Darren has to do is ring a bell, blow into kazoo, and do this absolutely ridiculous incantation. I don't remember other than he says, Yagazoo.
Yagazoozy, 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 Zim.
So
I don't know the second part.
Yeah, that's the best part anyway. So, so they go through this whole thing. Darren goes out to the living room and looks at Endora and Sam and basically says to Endora, "I'm going to teach you a lesson." And he rings his bell, blows the
kazoo.
The kazoo, thank you. I was going to say tuba, and I knew that one right. He rings the bell, blows the kazoo, and start doing the Yagazoozy, Yagazoozy. And Endora and Samantha are just looking at him like, what the hell are you doing?
It's so funny.
Because they don't even really understand that he's trying to do a spell. He's just acting insane. And he keeps doing it over and over again.
Oh, it's so funny. It's so funny. Dick York.
Darren finally realizes that Uncle Arthur has made a fool of him and pulled a prank. So then, because they all want to get even with Arthur, especially Endora and Darren, they decide to play a trick on Arthur. And so they make this plan, and so Arthur comes back, and Darren starts doing the Yagazoozy, ringing the bell, and doing the kazoo, and Samantha turns Endora into a parrot. Which sends Arthur into a panic because his sister is now a parrot. And of course, Darren doesn't know how to turn him back. And as we know from what has been established in the show, they broke it a few times, but
yeah,
actually more than a few times. But one witch is not supposed to be able to undo the spell of another witch.
Yeah, so that was pretty murky. Sometimes you could, sometimes you couldn't. It was very the rules. Yeah, the Witch's Book of Rules is very, very convoluted. Yeah,
it kind of depended on what they needed for the script.
Right.
So of course Arthur panics, and in the end, they bring Endora back, and Arthur swears his prank days are over. Which we know how well that went.
How long that lasted. I just love the idea of Agnes Moorehead and Paul Lynde being brother and sister. I think it is the most hysterical idea. What the hell kind of family is this? Actually, and where does Aunt Clara fit in? Is Aunt Clara and Dora, they're never clear. Is Aunt Clara and Dora's sister, her sister-in-law? Who's Hagatha? Who's Enchantress? I mean, it's so funny. You're not really sure how these people are related, yet they're all related in some way or another.
Actually, Clara is established as Endora's sister in one
She
episode.
is?
In one episode, and it may be one that you mentioned. It's the one where they want to take Clara's magic away from her.
Right. The trial and error of Aunt Clara, yes.
She basically is on trial, and it's actually one that I consider doing.
I love that episode.
And it is brought up, it's mentioned that Endora is her sister in that episode. The reason I didn't want to do that episode is because that is probably the one episode where Endora is the most evil, like uncomfortably evil.
I know. Why is she so mean to Clara? I don't understand that.
I don't know.
I don't get it. Clara has slight revenge on the episode I'm going to talk about after your next one, so we'll get to that. But I never understand why she's so mean to Clara. But I love when Clara gets her little cracks at her. There's one episode where Clara says something about Samantha, I know she's your mother, but she can be quite trying sometimes. That's funny. Oh my God.
So now we're going to move.
Yeah, I love that episode. I love The Joker as a Card. What a great episode.
Yes. And The Joker is a Card. It was from season 2, episode 5 in October of 1965. I should have said that earlier. So now we're going to move almost just over a year later. This is going to be season 3, episode 9 in November of 1966. And this one is called Short Happy Circuit. And I chose this one similar to the reason why I chose the other one with Paul Lynde, because I adore Aunt Clara.
Yeah.
Just love her. Who would not want Aunt Clara as their grandmother?
I know.
She is so sweet and so kind, and she tries so hard. It's heartbreaking that she can't do the magic like she used to. It bothers her, but she doesn't get upset about it because she's Clara. But she's just fumbling because she's an older witch and she's losing her magic. And in this one, it's another time when Samantha and Darren have Aunt Clara babysit.
You wonder why they always do that, because she's gonna do something. You just know she is.
Well, it's the same thing with Esmeralda.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
And Darren always says, "I think this is a bad idea," and Samantha's like, "Oh, don't worry. Nothing's going to go wrong."
Since you mentioned Esmeralda, I just want to quickly ask you a quick question. This is a little quiz for you. Because we talked about Aunt Clara, Marion Lauren, Alice Ghostley, Esmeralda. What seminal 60s film did Marion Lauren and Alice Ghostley appear in together right before Marion Lauren died?
Oh.
Do you know?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me a Designing Women question.
No, I do love her in Designing Women, but no.
Yeah, she's awesome. I don't know.
1960s film, a little movie you might have heard of called The Graduate.
Oh, are you serious?
There is a party scene in which Marion Lauren and Alice Ghostley play guests at this party together, and they're little cameos. But isn't that crazy?
That is.
Aunt Clara and Esmeralda together. It's like alternate universes colliding. And then there's Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft. You're like, where the fuck am I? What world is this?
And Anne Bancroft would make a great witch.
She would have been a wonderful Endora.
Mrs. Robinson. Oh, yeah, Mrs. Robinson would have been a great Endora.
But I interrupted you, so go ahead. Go back to the trial, the Short Happy Circuit of Aunt Clara.
Okay. So Aunt Clara shows up. I pretty much am sure that she shows up in their fireplace, which she's done quite often. You never know where Aunt Clara is going to show up. She either shows up in a closet or...
I used to slip down straight through. Right, whoosh.
And Aunt Clara, when she shows up, she's a little bit distraught because her longtime beau, Aki, has left her for a younger witch. Yeah. So she's a little disheartened, but she's, going to babysit Tabitha. And so Sam and Darren go to the Tate's house, again, to meet one of the obnoxious clients that they always have, who's going to make a pitch for McElroy shoes. Yes. That's what he owns. And Darren agrees if Aunt Clara does not use her witchcraft in front of Tabitha. Mm-hmm. But Clara being Clara, she can't resist. And what she does in the spell is she blows a fuse and blocks out the electricity in the entire eastern seaboard.
She causes a blackout on the entire eastern seaboard, which was inspired by the real life blackout.
Yes, I'm certain.
It was caused by, okay, so everybody, history books, it was caused by Aunt Clara on Morning Glory Circle.
It was all caused by Aunt Clara.
All caused by Aunt Clara.
So anyway, so Darren is trying to do this presentation at the Tate House, and this client is just a jerk. He just doesn't even want to pay attention. I don't know why he hired them to do this presentation, because he doesn't care. So Darren is trying to do it in the dark, and it's just not going well. They're trying to do it by candlelight and flashlight. And as Clara tries to fix the electrical problem, she calls Aki for help. And his powers are also starting to wane. And as such, he is only able to bring on the electricity at the Stevens home, which, of course, Gladys Kravitz,
of course,
looking out her window, is yelling to Abner that there's lights on at the Stevens home.
Abner!
So hearing that there is electricity at the Stevens home, they all decide to leave the Tate's house. Now, it's funny that the lights are off in the whole East Coast, but they don't seem to question that much why there is light on at the Stevens home. Gladys Kravitz seems the only one that seems to think that's like really odd. They question it, but
again. Nobody listens to Gladys.
Especially Abner. So anyway, they show up at the house, and Darren is able to do his presentation. And the way it ends is that Augie has to hide into a closet because they all show up.
He has to keep his arms up every time he puts his arms down.
Clara, yes, he has to keep his arms up to keep the light on. I forgot about that. That was hysterical. If he puts his hands down, the lights go off. So he has to keep his arms up. Well,
and he's an old man. He's an old man.
Yes, I felt so sorry for him. I wonder how long he had to do that during the takes. I kept thinking about that. Well, during this time, Gladys Kravitz looks in the window and sees the man with his arms up in the air. And when he takes them down, the lights go off, and then they go up. So the Tates and the client and the Stevens are at the house, and they're trying to do this presentation. It is not going well at all. Because as we know from this show, Darren's ad campaigns are absolutely horrible. I don't know how McMahon and Tate stayed in business. Even when Samantha came up with the campaigns for him, it's like, is she really a witch? Because that campaign sucked. But anyway, the guy doesn't buy into it. So Gladys Kravitz shows up. She sneaks into the house, and she goes, because the lights come back on, and she hides in the closet. Well, Augie is in there, so she screams and comes out. So they're like, she's trying to explain that there's somebody there, and there's chaos as usual when Gladys Kravitz is around. And Augie decides to leave. He has to leave because they open the door and he's not there. But when they open it up, he walks out the front door. But all of him is invisible except for his shoes.
Except for his shoes.
So Mr. McElroy, with McElroy shoes, is convinced that this was part of the campaign, and that ends the day. They get the client.
Once again, witchcraft got him into this mess, and witchcraft got him out of it. And how fortunate and how coincidental that it's a client for shoes that sells shoes. Isn't that just interesting? I love that episode. She's so...
Yes. It is so
Marion Lauren. Marion Lauren, there was no one like Marion Lauren. I feel like, the character in I think that this woman waited until she was in her 80s, till she finally hit. Now, Marion Lauren worked her entire life. She was on Broadway. She was in theater.
She was gorgeous.
She was a very beautiful woman. She has a great role in Strangers on a Train, the Hitchcock film. She was in Mr. Peepers, which is a TV show nobody knows, from the 50s, starring Wally Cox for years. But this was the overnight success of Marion Lauren. Finally, she won the Emmy, but she, unfortunately, as we said, it was posthumously given to her because she died the following year. She died the year, the fourth season of Bewitched, which has the episode that I want to talk about.
I want to say one more thing before you move on. I know you're going to talk about her too.
Yeah.
I told you my mom and I used to watch this show, and there are two characters that my mom talked about all the time. First of all, we loved Aunt Clara, and the fact that she had a doorknob collection, which Marion Lauren apparently had in real life.
She really did.
Which
Yes.
is hysterical.
Yes.
She had a doorknob. And I'm like, to my mom, I thought that's ridiculous. My mom's like, no, she really, in real life, she has a doorknob collection. And we both adored Clara. The other person that my mom talked about a lot was Mrs. Stevens, Darren's mother.
The fabulous Mabel Albertson.
Yes, played by Mabel Albertson. And her, Frank, I have a sick headache. And my mom didn't find the least bit funny. She was so sympathetic. She's like, why don't they, that poor woman thinks she's crazy. Please tell her.
I love poor
Samantha's a witch.
Mabel Albertson. I love Mabel Albertson.
Yes.
She annoys me a little bit in this series sometimes because she's just so, how can you not love Elizabeth Montgomery? How can you be so antagonistic towards Samantha? She's so beautiful and charming and lovely. But it's funny, Elizabeth, I said a little bit about how Agnes Moorehead had a tendency to test people. She didn't test Mabel Albertson. Mabel Albertson would not put up with her shit.
That doesn't surprise me.
According to Elizabeth Montgomery, she said, because Mabel wouldn't have any of it. So I love that about Mabel Albertson. And she's like, oh, no, you don't, Aggie. Not with me, you don't, girl. So I love that.
So on to your next one.
So my next one is from the 4th season, as I said. This has got to be... I have so many. It's so hard to say, but it really, really is near the very top of my all-time favorite episodes. It's season 4, episode 11, 118 in the series, and it's called Allergic to Macedonian Dodo Birds. And it's from November 16th, 1967, and this written by Richard Baer and directed by Richard Kinnan. Now, there are lots of reasons why I like this episode. What happens in this episode is Endora loses her powers due to exposure to an ancient Macedonian dodo bird. So apparently she's allergic, as the title says, to this ancient Macedonian dodo bird. But she doesn't remember when it happened because dodo birds have been extinct for centuries. So it's a real problem. And Endora is basically earthbound and has to live with Darren and Samantha, which, as you can imagine...
You have never seen her so pitiful.
Oh, well, that's number one why I love this episode. Agnes Moorehead is hysterical. She is so pathetic when she loses her powers. Her voice even changes. That powerful voice she has. Oh, yeah. It's come this little weak thing. And she goes, I've lost me powers. And she goes, Darwood, help me.
What was it she was trying to pick up? A coffee pot.
Coffee? Oh, it's heavy. She goes, but she comes, she stays the night. She spends the night. She comes down in the morning and she still doesn't have her powers. And Samantha says, Mother, would you pour the coffee? And she can't do it by witchcraft. So she stands up and she goes to pick up the coffee pot and she almost falls over. She goes, it's heavy. So that's it. She's so funny. She's still calling him Durwood, though. And she's asking him for help. And he says to her, if you're going to ask me for help, at least you can call me by my correct name. And she goes, I'll try. What is it? And he says, Darren. And she goes, I'll try. And a few moments pass and she says, Dennis. So she's also playing with him. That's what I also love about it, because there's this look in her eye like, yes, she's feeling helpless and she doesn't have a, but she's still giving the screws to Durwood, which I think is so funny. So I love this episode for that reason. I love this episode because it also has Aunt Clara. Because what happens when Endora loses her powers? Well, Dr. Bombay, which is number 3 why I love this episode, because of the wonderful Dr. Bombay is in it, says that she's having an allergic reaction to a Macedonian dodo bird. And what happens when she hasn't lost her powers? They're out in the atmosphere. And Endora goes, they're just hanging out in the atmosphere. And he says, no, unless a witch who is a relative whose own powers are beginning to weaken should come in contact with them. And what do you suppose happens at that exact moment? Boom, 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 smoke, fire. There's Aunt Clara in a fetching new hat, in a wonderful little outfit, fully powered.
And extremely powerful.
Extremely powerful. And of course, it's so funny because she doesn't know why. She's just like, I got, the zip back in my zing. So
and she's cocky. I love how cocky she is.
She's but still sweet. still sweet Aunt Clara, but she's feeling her oats, because now she can do things. She makes this sumptuous meal and she's going to go off and have dinner somewhere else. And so they realize that Aunt Clara probably has Endora's powers. And she comes back, and this is my favorite line, I think, ever in Bewitched. Aunt Clara says to Samantha, I know you think I stole Endora's powers. I didn't steal Endora's powers. I had no idea what's happening, she says. And she goes, I'm a swinger, and I like to swing. Can you imagine? Just think about Marion Lawrence saying, I'm a swinger, and I like to swing. Oh, it's so funny. So, of course, yes, what happens is they find out eventually, because Endora keeps saying, where's Tabitha? She's been up in her room all day. I want to see Tabitha, in this really annoying, whining voice. Well, it turns out that Tabitha, from one of her picture books, has materialized an ancient Macedonian dodo bird, which is this ridiculous, this massive puppet that comes down the stairs behind Tabitha. It's very funny. So they're actually able to pluck, part of the antidote is plucking the tail of the dodo bird, putting in Dr. Bombay's drink. Endora drinks it, and of course, her powers are completely back. She's Endora again. And just at that moment, you hear a commotion on the roof. And who is it? It's Aunt Clara, who's been waylaid. She was at the yacht races. And suddenly she's on the roof and she can't get down. So things are back to normal. It is such a funny episode. I think it's also the reason, as I said, this was Marion Lawrence's last season. She won a posthumous Emmy for Best Supporting Actress in a Comedy. So well deserved. It wasn't her final episode, but it was one of the final episodes.
And you missed the part that I thought was the funniest in the episode.
What's that?
Is when she said she's going to go yachting, and boom, the neighborhood is an ocean, and she's on a boat. And when Gladys Kravitz looks out the window, I mean, she's seen many things looking out that window, but she looks out and sees the water, yes. And you see Clara there with her little sitting in her dinghy.
Oh. And then Samantha immediately changes it back, though. How could she do that? Because it's another witch's spell.
Yeah, that's another one where they broke the rule.
There you go. The murky waters of witchdom on Bewitched. I love Bernard Fox, Dr. Bombay, as I said before. He had actually been a guest star the second season playing a witch hunter. And like Paul Lynde, he made such an impression that they brought him back as a witch character. And I just think Dr. Bombay is a scream. Everybody is working at their utmost. Dick York is so funny in this episode. Agnes Moorehead, as I said, brilliantly funny. Marion Lawrence steals my heart every time because she's a swinger and she likes to swing. So that's allergic to Macedonian dodo birds. Now, what's your last episode of this? What's your last choice for this episode, Brad?
My last choice for this episode, and I chose it because we didn't do the pilot. And this is almost like a replay of the pilot, but it doesn't feel like it. It fits.
Yeah.
But it's very, very, very similar. It's called Snob in the Grass. And this brings back Darren's ex-fiancée, Sheila.
The divine Sheila.
Played by Nancy Kovac, who's just wonderful because she is such a snotty bitch. And she's hysterical.
She is. I looks her.
Slapstick funny at the same time.
Yeah.
When the fly or the bee lands on her nose, and she's looking cross-eyed at it, she looks so elegant, and all of a sudden she's like this cartoon clown, and I'm like laughing hysterically. So anyway.
Do you know that Nancy Kovacs was originally going to be a recurring character who was going to be a foil for Samantha, but it didn't work out. So yeah, I'm sorry, but I interrupted you. Go back.
No, that would have been interesting. So Darren, again, there's a client that they're trying to impress, and it happens to be Sheila's father. So Larry Tate says, Darren, you got to get a hold of Sheila. And Sharon's like, no. Well, as Larry usually does, I don't know if he tried to fire Darren as he does 10,000 times or whatever.
Every time.
Whatever it is. They're best friends, but he's always ready to fire Darren.
Yeah.
He wants Darren to swoo Sheila so that they can win the Summers account, which is the company owned by Sheila's father. So Darren does meet up with Sheila in a bar. Well, actually, he and Larry go to the bar to meet Sheila and her father.
Right.
Sheila alone shows up, and Larry, being the asshole that Larry can be, excuses himself and leaves, leaving Darren with Sheila, who is being very seductive, trying to get him back.
As she did in the pilot.
Like she did in the pilot, yes.
It's basically
just
the
like
same.
she did in the pilot.
It's the pilot in
Yes.
color.
Exactly.
Pilot in color.
She doesn't want to let Darren go. She wants him to dump his little housewife. And Endora at this time has already been talking to Samantha that she thinks Darren is cheating. Darren says, of course not. So as he and Sheila are sitting at a table, and Sheila has her hands all over Darren, and Dora shows up as a waitress and throws the tray of food into Darren.
That's such a funny moment.
She turns around. They're trying to order, and she turns around wearing this ridiculous waitress outfit, and it's Endora. The look.
It's Endora, and she throws the plate right in his lap, and then she just looks at him and smiles.
Yes, before that, the look on Darren's face.
Yes.
Like, oh, shit.
Yes.
So Samantha will not talk to Darren, and they reconcile. She finally believes Darren that this was something going on. And Darren says, we have to go to this party that Sheila is holding. And so in the first episode, she told Samantha that it was going to be a casual affair. And so Samantha shows up wearing casual clothing. And of course, it's a formal affair.
Mm-hmm.
So this time, Sheila says, it's a casual affair. We're just doing like a little picnic. Well, it's a very wealthy little picnic. And Samantha says, I'm not going to fall for it again this time.
Yes.
And Samantha dresses up very formally, and Darren has on a tux. I guess she convinced Darren to wear the tux. Sheila opens up the door, and once again, she fooled Samantha. It is indeed a casual affair.
Yeah.
And very quickly, though, Darren says, we have another affair we have to go to after this one.
Yeah. He saves
Very
it.
good.
Yeah.
That did save it. So she's not humiliated in that way. But the rest of the time, Sheila is talking down to Samantha. She's talking about they're going to go on this trip, and she's invited all her friends to go on this trip. I can't remember where it was, but this very expensive trip. And she says to Samantha, what are you doing this summer? Why don't you come with us? And Samantha's like, we're replacing our plumbing. So then there's a bee flying around Sheila's head, bee or a fly. We don't really ever find out. And so Samantha has it land on Sheila's nose. And Sheila's like freaking out, looking cross-eyed at her nose, just looking ridiculous. She tells the butler to do something about it. It gets in her hair, and he smacks her head, knocking her wig off.
She's a blonde.
Which happened in the first episode. Yes, she is a blonde.
And she's a blonde.
Yes, it happened in the first episode. She's a brunette, but nope, she's really a blonde. Her wig comes off. Then the dog happens to be next to the hose. And Samantha turns on the hose and has the dog pick it up in its mouth. Well, then the dog very quickly gets muddy.
Yes.
And the dog runs over and jumps on Sheila, covering her with mud. And Sheila jumps up. She's absolutely humiliated. And that's Samantha's revenge. And of course, at the end,
You missed the part where Samantha twitches Sheila's sweater.
oh yes,
And she makes the
Yes.
loops go around the dog's collar, and the dog runs off, and Sheila's shirt becomes undone, and her dress is
it stops right at her bra, about halfway up her bra. It stopped further up than I thought they would stop.
totally unwinds,
And that
she's
is
almost
when Sheila loses it.
Sheila loses it.
She runs to her father, just absolutely devastated. And what's great is Darren, they get the account, or did they? They may have lost it. But when they get home, Samantha apologizes, and this happens a few times. Darren says, it's okay, she deserved it.
She did. Well, how about she can never remember Samantha? How hard is that? Samsara? Samatar?
Yes.
Samovar?
Yes.
It's like Samantha. How hard is that to remember?
It's the Endora with Darren.
It is.
She does it
really
on purpose. Part of her being condescending to Samantha. And she even makes fun of the name.
You know what I love about this episode, other than, the wonderful Nancy Kovacs, and it's just such a fun episode, is that, yes, it is basically a remake of Act 2 of the pilot in color. But unlike when they remade episodes later in later seasons of Bewitched, it had its own bones. It had its own structure. It wasn't just an out-and-out remake of an old episode.
No, it served a purpose.
It served a purpose. It had its own premise. And yes, it was very similar. But it was fun to see it in color as opposed to black and white. And the different things Samantha did to Sheila this time as opposed to the first time. And she deserved every one of them.
And I like that it added continuity to the story. They actually brought Nancy Kovac
Yes.
back because I didn't remember that. I'm like, okay, is it going to be Nancy Kovac? And I was so happy it was.
Oh, yes.
So it did add continuity of the story that this is something that happened 3 years before. And here we go again. They reunited and we had the same chaos as before. So I just loved this episode. It made me laugh.
This is a fun episode. Well, those are our episodes for the Dick York era. Wow, that was quite a chunk that we went through. But it was a lot of fun. You know, there are, as we said at the beginning, there are so many more episodes. There's a wonderful episode called Accidental Twins where Aunt Clara mistakenly turns the Tate's son into twins. It's hysterically funny, using the twin actors who played them. There's a bunch of wonderful episodes we never got to, but these ones were definitely fun. So
Tony's going to have some excellent trivia as well.
there is more trivia to come in part 2 of our Bewitched, of our Happy Birthday Bewitched episodes, when we tackle the Dick Sargent years and we talk a little bit about what exactly happened with Dick York, what the atmosphere was like when that was happening, how the whole Dick Sargent switch came about, its aftermath, and some episodes from that era. I also want to talk a little bit about a little show which is kind of like the air quotes genie in the room, a little episode you might know, a little show you might know called I Dream of Jeannie, and just what Elizabeth Montgomery really thought about I Dream of Jeannie. But you'll have to stay tuned for our next episode on Bewitched to find out.
And I'm looking forward to it.
Good. So without further ado, this has been a long one, Brad. This has been quite a chunk. But still,
Yes.
I let's not say goodbye. Let's just say au revoir.
Now, let's say goodbye.
Goodbye.